Welcome back to Uncorked from Archaeology Now, the Houston chapter of the Archaeological Institute of America. I'm Lucas Livingston, the creator and host of the Ancient Art Podcast and a board member of the Chicago Museum. In Uncorked, we pop the top off of the history of alcoholic beverages from around the world and across the ages. This time, we're twisting the tap on the European brewing tradition of the Middle Ages. In this episode, we're going from Gruit to hops and getting medieval on beer. Now, beer wasn't born overnight in medieval Europe. Beer brewing had a long tradition in Europe, going well back into prehistory. The modern, popular, and highly flawed narrative is that beer before the Middle Ages was an unhopped, herbed ale called Gruit, brewed on a domestic homebrew scale by the alewives and brewsters, or women of the household and community. Gradually, in the Middle Ages, beer gets taken out of the hands of private women and shifts to the monasteries, the proverbial brewing monk, and they turn home brewing into a robust industry. Around the year 1300, hops replace Gruit, and we get something like modern beer. Also, sometime around there, we see a shift from the monastic brewing to official breweries of the noble courts, the Hofbräu. And then the final stage is a shift from court breweries to commercial breweries controlled by merchant barons, which spurs substantial expansion and standardization, bringing us to something that starts to resemble our modern era of commercialism and beer styles. All that being said, as much as we can support any of these broad brush strokes, we can just as easily peel back the narrative to reveal plenty of exceptions, contradictions, and romantic mythologizing. And here, we're only going to be able to skim the surface. Some of the earliest archaeological evidence for barley beer in Europe comes from Iberia, or historic Spain and Portugal. Excavations of a late 5th millennium BC cave near Barcelona have revealed evidence of barley malting, milling, and fermentation. And in the 4th, 3rd, and 2nd millennia BC, we have archaeological evidence for beer, wine, and mead making throughout continental Europe, Scandinavia, and the British Isles. And somewhat conforming to our modern day presumptions, wine took a strong foothold in the Mediterranean, especially initially the Eastern Mediterranean, while prehistoric evidence for beer and mead is found more across temperate Northern Europe. A survey of archaeological sites across northern continental Europe and the UK, published in 1999 by Carl Ernst Baer, shows very limited evidence for hops from the Neolithic through the Roman periods. And this evidence for hops drastically rises in the early Middle Ages before 1000 CE. And this would certainly support our understanding for when hops became popular in brewing, while the pre-medieval evidence could suggest that hopped ales may have been brewed, but few and far between. The preservative nature of the resinous oils in hops is well understood today. At a time before widespread refrigeration, pasteurization, and airtight containers, a number of different botanicals were used to help aid the preservation of beer. We mentioned the use of tree resins in ancient brewing and winemaking in earlier episodes of Uncorked. Across much of Scandinavia, where hops don't grow quite like a weed, there's a long history of brewing beer with the resinous branches of the juniper tree. A residue analysis published by Patrick McGovern in 2013 revealed traces of juniper in Danish beer from both 800 BCE and 200 CE. And we know that juniper remains popular in Scandinavian farmhouse brewing today, thanks to the excellent documentary evidence of Lars Garshol. Further south in continental Europe, where juniper is less prevalent, Bog Myrtle was a popular brewing ingredient prior to the use of hops. Bog myrtle, sometimes called sweet gale, with the species name Myrica gale, is a shrub that grows naturally in sandy soil and marshy bogs along the European Atlantic coastal regions. Until around the 13th century, in the northern lowland regions of France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Denmark, and Germany, Bog Myrtle was the primary ingredient in beer aside from barley, water, and yeast. Going back to that 1999 article by Carl Ernst Baer, which surveyed a number of European archaeological sites, Bog Myrtle continues to be found at sites beyond the 13th century, telling us that the switch to hops wasn't overnight across Europe. As I mentioned in the intro, we commonly like to call the early unhopped herbed ale Gruit. And that's Gruit. Now, it's neither spelled like the Marvel superhero, nor should we really pronounce it that way. A more authentic pronunciation, as much as this Midwesterner can do, would be something closer to kraut. So like kraut and sauerkraut, right? Furthermore, it's also less accurate to call the drink itself kraut. The drink we should simply call ale or beer, although some will argue that we ought to reserve beer for describing hopped ale. It gets complicated. Kraut, more precisely, was the specific mixture of herbs used during the brewing process, and the word is first attested only at the end of the 10th century. The recipe and distribution of kraut was highly codified and regulated. The authority of granting the privilege to brew ale with kraut was strictly controlled by the nobility, something called Grautrecht, or Graut right, or privilege. Records from medieval grout houses or grout production facilities shine some light on the herbs that went into kraut. Of course, the aforementioned bog myrtle was a primary ingredient, especially in the Netherlands and Germany and along the Rhineland. Other ingredients have been interpreted as bay laurel berries and laserwort. In other regions, instead of bog myrtle, something called porche is indicated as the primary bittering agent, which may have been wild rosemary or marsh rosemary with the scientific name Rhododendron tomentosum, formerly Latum paluster. You'll see it written like that a lot. Or some historians wonder if porche was just another name for bog myrtle. None of these herbs have an especially strong preservative effect, however. So one very important ingredient to kraut that historians often overlook is sap, or resin. And just as we see throughout antiquity and in some traditional farmhouse brewing practices today, resin has been a critical ingredient to beer's shelf life. Hops packed a triple punch for the rapid and effective replacement of kraut. The bitter flavor and herbal aroma were agreeable substitutes to kraut. Also, hops literally grew like weeds and weren't controlled and taxed like kraut at first. And thirdly, hopped beer had a longer shelf life. The greater preservative quality of hop oils meant the ale wouldn't need to be quite as high in alcohol content, and therefore hopped ale could be weaker and more drinkable, requiring less malt and lowering production costs, which benefited both the brewer and the consumer. Historians and beer fans alike commonly credit the first century Roman historian Pliny the Elder with being the first to mention hops in his Natural History. Sidebar, is it pronounced Pliny or Pliny? Well, that depends whether you're a classicist or a cicerone. In listing the various edible wild plants of Italy, Pliny includes lupum salictarium and calls it more of a delicacy than a staple. He doesn't even hint that it was used in beer, and we can't even be sure that he was talking about hops. Lupum salictarium translates as willow wolf. The species name for hops is Humulus lupulus. Did historians just fixate on the common usage of wolf in both terms and assume Pliny was talking about hops? Whether or not Pliny was talking about hops, it's not for another 500 years when we have our first tantalizing suggestion of a hopped ale. An analysis of the residue at the bottom of a mug found in the 6th century grave at Trossingen, Baden-Württemberg, Germany, revealed the signatures of a barley and wheat ale brewed with honey. The analysis also found pollen grains in the residue from multiple herbs and flowers, including ribwort, goosefoot, and wild buckwheat, cornflower, and a single pollen grain of our friend Humulus lupulus, or hops. A couple hundred years later, in the 700s, we start to encounter definitive evidence in the written records of Europe for the cultivation of hops. A document from the year 768 mentions a hop garden near the Benedictine Weihenstephan Abbey in Bavaria, which was ordered to tithe 10% of its crop to the abbey, presumably for the brewing of beer. And having been officially licensed as a brewery in 1042, Weihenstephaner is widely regarded as the world's oldest active brewery today. Hop gardens must have been a latest fad in 768, because in that same year, we find mention of the Humulonariae in the will of King Pepin the Short, and then very quickly were struck by an avalanche of evidence for brewing beer with hops in the monasteries of northern France, Belgium, and Germany. Up until this point in the 8th century, brewing was largely done on a household scale. Following this point, monasteries became centers for Europe's earliest large-scale brewing industry, and beer brewing truly became a specialized craft where we can identify an interest in consistency and quality, not only for enjoyment, but also for medicinal purposes. Consistent with our modern popular expression that beer was safer to drink than the water, Hildegard von Bingen, the 12th century abbess and an advisor to Emperor Frederick I Barbarossa, recommended beer over water for one's health. She also described the preservative qualities of hops in beer and tells us that hops will increase our black bile bodily humor, which the ancient Greeks called melancholy. I guess she was trying to tell us that hops will make you drowsy. Unsurprisingly, the history of beer and brewing with hops is deeply interwoven with financial gain. The earliest mention in the Netherlands of brewing with hops is in 1321. When the Count of Holland banned the import of hopped beer from Hamburg, Germany, because it was hurting the revenue from domestic Gruit sales. Seeing the writing on the wall, Holland permits domestic brewing with hops, provided the tax revenue was the same. And then, in 1364, Emperor Charles IV further complained of falling Gruit revenue on account of this quote-unquote new brewing method with a certain herb called hops. In time, of course, hops came to dominate, but brewers continued to include all manner of adjuncts in their brewing. Medieval and Renaissance cookbooks and brewing manuals helpfully instruct us that we can aid the preservation of our beer or mask its spoilage by, of course, dry hopping it, or we can add eggs, linseed oil, oyster shells, or toss in a handful of ashes. And to clarify one's beer, the brewer could use pig or ox hoof, salt, lime, sand, tree bark, or dried fish bladder. Easter egg, at least 2 of these ingredients, continue to be used in brewing today. And time again, in an effort to ensure a safe and consistently drinkable product, no matter where you travel throughout the realm, German rulers passed one after another law to regulate brewing. One of the earliest was in 1156, when Emperor Frederick Barbarossa decreed, "A brewer who makes bad beer or pours an unjust measure shall be punished. His beer shall be destroyed or distributed with no charge among the poor." Worst untapped review ever. The most celebrated German beer purity law, of course, is the Reinheitsgebot of April 26, 1516, which stipulated that only barley, hops, and water can be used to brew beer. Initially, the law applied only to Bavaria, and it's only in the early 20th century when all of Germany adopted it. Today, the Reinheitsgebot is often cited as the world's oldest existing food law. Wrapping things up here, brewing was a good trade for women in the Middle Ages, especially among older widows and unmarried women. Brewing was one of the few trades accessible to independent women. While large-scale brewing certainly required considerable capital, Home brewing on the side was an efficient way for the woman of a house or a single woman to generate modest income. That is, of course, until women were systematically pushed out of the brewing business in the late Middle Ages. One of the best modern sources for more information about the history of women and brewing is Judith Bennett's 1996 book, Ale, Beer, and Brewsters in England, Women's Work in a Changing World, 1300 to 1600. Thankfully, Bennett's authoritative work avoids all this current, unsubstantiated, wild conjecture about brewsters and alewives giving rise to our modern image of witches in popular culture. For more on that topic, check out these resources, Brachyatrix.com, the Beer Ladies podcast, and get in touch with me about the conversation I recently hosted with the Chicago Museum and the Salem Witch Museum. Thanks so much for watching. Be sure to check out our other episodes of Uncorked and more original video content from Archaeology Now.